Hello. I'd like to talk a little bit about the topic of shame and regrets and beating ourselves up, so to speak. I know there's a lot of work done on the shame topic, for instance, by Brené Brown. My perspective on shame at the present time is that it involves someone who criticizes us for a flaw or a goal we don't meet, followed by abandoning us either physically or emotionally if we don't change. Now that comes from the outside, this abandonment issue, and I tie that then to shame. But what about the concept of beating ourselves up, so to speak, or shall we say a lack of self-acceptance? I kind of look at this way, that it involves a failure to understand goals we have set for ourselves that are impossible to meet. And when we fail to meet them, we chide ourselves, we beat ourselves up, so to speak. And we keep pressing to achieve that goal in the future when it might not be possible in the short term or ever. So, for instance, there's this Buddhist man in Australia, Ajahn Brahm, who tells us regularly in his lectures, to not be so hard on yourself, to not beat yourself up. You might say, too, I think Sean Stephenson, Dr. Sean Stephenson, the man once alive in a wheelchair, no legs, he urged us, too, to love ourselves. Of course, what does that mean, then? Well, my book, that would mean setting goals that are feasible in our lives, that we recognize as such, not what society tells us we should do, or to include keeping up with the Joneses, our neighbors, and so on. Easier said than done. And when we don't meet those goals that are consistently not modified, I guess it's called beating ourselves up. Chronic unrealistic goals. Now, why we keep setting these, it's a very interesting topic. I don't want to cover all in one fell swoop as to my thoughts on this right now. But I would say this, that if we don't know our limits as human beings and what's built into ourselves as creatures, animals, biological animals that limit us, then our goals are going to be infeasible at times. And if we don't modify that, we'll keep beating ourselves up about what we don't accomplish. Which leads me then to a final conclusion, and that's that some very, very talented people talk of how they don't want to go on their deathbed and regret this or that. So the whole topic of regrets enters in then, I believe, as a very important issue too, in how we beat ourselves up perhaps on our deathbed or in later years. But what is a regret, in my book, other than a false notion of what we could have accomplished if only we had certain resources or a lack of certain constraints? So I think all too often our society tells us that this or that is impossible or possible, or that certain restraints don't exist, certain constraints when they do exist. We have a false notion then all too often of our having no constraints wired into us. This is a topic I'll address in another avenue. But it's a very serious one, I believe, that holds us back and may result in later years in this concept of regrets. And earlier in life, what I call beating yourself up. Others have referred to it by that phrase, too. Not being compassionate with ourselves, you might say. Not accepting ourselves, not accepting our flaws. And of course, the biggest thing is not knowing why certain flaws are so hard, if not impossible, to ever overcome. I'll leave this with a phrase I remember from Clint Eastwood in a movie, was it Sudden Impact or Dirty Harry series? He said, a man has to know his limitations. But he didn't elucidate, of course, and neither does society in general, I think, as to what those limitations are. I'll talk about my ideas on this later at some point very soon. But I would say that many of these are simply hardwired into us biologically. And thus, that's what it means to be a human and not a god, so to speak. We have to know our limitations that are wired into us and make us do what we do, often repeatedly, and then we uncannily tend to forget those things, or we're urged not to see them in the first place, and that results in beating ourselves up and later in life regrets that both aren't warranted, I would say. I wish you well.